just want it to go on record. I fuck with the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Hey.
Hello.
Welcome to Left Unread.
Yes, my name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're simply two Mandela-Morganist Lysenkoists seeking to enact a great plan to transform nature.
That we are. And this special 50th episode, I don't know that it's special, but we have, for the first time, revisited a text. We have reread State and Revolution.
Yes, by V.I. Lenin. You know him, you love him.
By Lenin.
Yeah, I mean, I figured it would be appropriate to revisit this because it's been 2 years, man. We've read a lot, and I'd say we've changed a lot. And not only did we reread this, but we also went back and listened to those 2 episodes. I can't believe we did it as a 2-parter.
Yeah. Well, early on, I had it in my mind that I wanted to not get too deep in our page count so we could really focus on the conversation around the content. And so I had it in my mind. It was not a hard limit, but it was like, let's try to strive for like 75 pages a go. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whatever that would be. And we just got to the point where we wanted to do more reading that was too limiting. But that early on, I mean, that's episodes 2 and 3 of the show.
Yeah.
We were still trying to hold by that. So yeah, crazy to split it up, but we did.
I mean, whatever. Anyway. But it's been 2 years, we read quite a lot, and I think we've developed quite a bit. So we're back again with State and Revolution. How do you want to try to tackle this thing?
I guess I have my notes are kind of split in 2 categories. I have thoughts about where we were when we read it the first time and re-listening to the episodes. And I have thoughts about the text now rereading it. If it were me, I'd probably start with looking back on where we were at the start of the show 2 years ago. If that's not too self-indulgent or whatever.
I don't think so. I mean, shit, it's our podcast.
Yeah, so I never listen to the shows after editing them. Once I get them all cut together and put together, I put them out there. And I've never listened to another one again.
Yeah, I listen to them kind of as proof just to make sure there's no editing issues or anything like that. And I do enjoy listening to them. So I've heard us develop over this 2 years, believe it or not.
Yeah, it's not been as evident to me for that reason. And so going back and listening to the episodes, it's kind of interesting from that kind of, I don't know, more objective perspective to look at where the show was, where we were at that time. And compare it to where we are now. Not that there's some intimation that there were some highly developed dudes or whatever. Nothing like that. But it's just interesting. I don't know. I guess I have a collection of thoughts. First, just about the episodes. Mm-hmm. It's funny to listen back to where, I won't speak for you, so I'll say where I was in my development at that time. There are a lot of things that I said on the show that I certainly wouldn't say today or wouldn't fully endorse. And a lot of that comes from the development that's happened over the last 2 years. And it's funny, I was talking to my wife about this because there's something like, it sparked my revolutionary optimism. Because listening back to the show, I'm like, this is 2 years ago. We have no formal, I don't know how formal it gets, but we have no formal education in this. This is just you and I reading books and talking about them.
Yeah.
And to see the development in our theory, our thought, and our ability to apply that just in a 2-year span is like really inspiring. And it got me thinking a lot about, I was talking to my wife about Mao and like the mass line and his devotion to the people and how, you hear this rhetoric all the time about communists need to speak to the people, not above the people. And while I think there's a grain of truth in that, like you and I are evidence that anyone can get it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It really is not above anyone's head. It's not above the consciousness of the people. You just got to fucking read.
Yeah. I 100% agree with that because that's something that's really evident listening back to these episodes is an uncertainty. And it's not that we have the golden solution now, it's not that we have it perfectly figured out. Certainly not. There are still millions of questions to be answered, including the very same questions we asked when we first read this book.
Of course.
But the difference is on this second read of this, there's so many things that Lenin says that don't even faze me in the same way. Like, when he talks about winning the battle of democracy and like the way that democracy withers away, I remember that being something that was like almost stomach churning. I was like, I don't know what's going on with this. But now looking back at it, it's totally evident what he's actually saying. And there's even things where I'm like, I can't believe I missed this. But of course, 2 years ago, me missed that because I didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So much of our discussion of it the first time was about centering that kind of shedding our liberal discomfort. You know what I mean? Yeah. So much of it came from that. And exactly like you said, reading it now, I'm just like completely unfazed. And to the point where rereading it this time, I was like, had the thought to myself, this isn't even very radical. He doesn't have much to say that's radical outside of the implied violence of the revolution. Yeah. You know what I mean? That was just wild to me. The other thing I would say about that is that I don't think we anticipated it per se, and I certainly didn't. And I don't know how easily I would have recognized it happening in the moment. But looking back, it's so clear how foundational this was to all of the other reading that we did, to my understanding of the application of theory, especially around the dictatorship of the proletariat. And how, my take on it initially wasn't some epiphanic, like big light switch has been clicked kind of thing. But nearly every bit of reading that we've done since reading this the first time is built on the foundations of what he's saying here. And, I can recall, and my working memory is flawed as it is, how many times we're saying, like, it's just like Lenin said, you know, and how much everything else that we've read and our understanding was built on this.
I absolutely agree. I mean, this book has made a permanent impression on how I view the state, period. I've talked a lot about the so-called Leninist definition of the state. It's just because, like, that had always been such a big question on my mind. Like, what is the role of the state in all of this? Like, is it necessary? Is it something that needs to be kept? All of those things were questions that I had before when it came to the context of, like, real positive change for society. Yippee! And Lenin does so much to set the stage for what that actually means. And he talks about it with such a concreteness that it's impossible for me to disagree with at this point, And so, yeah, a completely foundational text. I could not have picked a better starting point, essentially, basically, than this one, I would say. I mean, we did read Principles of Communism first, but still, in terms of, like, the classics of theory, this book is so goddamn good.
In terms of the actual show, I've got cheers and jeers for those episodes, I guess. Jeer number 1, I started episode 2 by saying I was just as much an anarchist as a communist, which is funny to me now. I look back at that and I laugh. I recognize my sympathy with anarchism, and I'm not interested in infighting. Communists will tell you that that's not infighting, but I'm not interested in arguments between anarchists and communists until the day that is relevant. But that's certainly not something I would say anymore, so I guess jeer on that one. Cheer is, I think the Internationale joke landed. The fact that we keep like anytime we would say like dictatorship of the proletariat or whatever, put the echo on there with the deeper voice and the Internationale like kick in and out real quick. I forgot that we had done that. Yeah. It was really funny to me this time.
We certainly have found more of a footing in the more recent years, but we've lost a couple of things, a couple of things.
Yeah, the show is definitely more structured too. And from a formalist perspective, we were definitely just like going through the pages and just kind of talking through our reactions. Those 2 episodes in particular, we're pulling from the text very rarely.
Yeah.
It's mostly us just kind of talking about our reaction to it, and less like actually digging into the text itself, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So there is a little bit of a shift in the show in that. And there are other things that you see not quite being formed there yet. Like, we didn't do a cavalcade.
Right.
Our ending was a little different. Our intro was a little different. You were definitely responsible for the 2 dudes engaged in a radical self-education bit, and we hadn't quite nailed that down yet. It's fun to see that. I guess it's evident to me listening back. Maybe it's not as evident to everyone, but being on the inside, it's evident to me how green we were and how maybe a little more guarded, but also not in an operational security sense more guarded.
Yeah.
We were at that time, and it's just interesting to think back on that. Like, it feels, I don't want to say it feels like a lifetime ago, but feels like longer than 2 years ago, especially considering how much I feel my political development has grown. I am an idiot. I was absurdly an idiot. And I'm a grown-ass man. I was a grown-ass man 2 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, I guess the underlying message there is it's never too late and it's not too much.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I totally agree. I mean, like, I also am a grown man. Shocking. But like, there's a sense of maturity that you get from, I mean, not only like having these kind of readings under your belt, but also being able to discuss them. It goes back to that certainty, like that firmness that you have in your belief. And it's at the point where it's not something that feels unfounded necessarily anymore. Not that, I feel communism deep in my bones. I just do. But the ability to kind of stand your ground when it comes to what you believe, that's something that is trained, and that's something that I feel really I've been able to develop that skill quite well over the last 2 years, believe it or not.
Yeah. And, the other thing, so much of our first reading of this was based around questions like, well, we just kind of have to take him on at his word for that because I don't know about the Paris Commune. Right. I don't know. I've never read the Gotha program, the critique of the Gotha program. You know what I mean? And it's funny now because going through every reference that he's making, I think there's only one text that he references that we haven't read on the show.
The Engels' Private Property.
Some other Engels one. Anyway.
Yeah.
It's irrelevant.
But that's the thing, though, is that like going back and reading this, though, it's like we just read Gotha program,
Mm-hmm.
And so to see Lenin talk about it so directly when we were just discussing those exact points, it's really nice, really refreshing. And, there's parts that I was like, I agree. And there's parts where I'm like, I still don't really understand necessarily.
I found two notes because I'm reading from the same edition that I read back then. And so I found two notes where I wrote, I don't really understand or something like that to myself in the margins. And I happily was like, I get it now, So that was really cool.
Oh, yeah.
One other personal reflection about that time and our first reading of it is early on in the show, I was like pretty quick to say like, I don't really feel comfortable calling myself, a communist or calling myself this because I feel like an imposter. I feel like to say that implies some knowledge, some experience, certainly with these texts, with organizing, whatever. And I felt like I didn't have those things. And I don't feel that reticence anymore, for better or worse, I guess, depending on your perspective. But I would wholeheartedly call myself a communist today. I do wholeheartedly call myself a communist today. And again, that's 2 years ago. It's not that long ago. That's cool.
Yeah. Hard to put into words. It's really just something that, similar to the highest phase of communism, as Lenin says in here, it's not something that's introduced. It's just something that arrives. Like, we've kind of come to this point. It's not like I read this book, now I am a communist. It's like my communism has developed now that it actually exists.
Yeah.
Okay. Very, very, very stressed metaphor there. But regardless, it's just the case. You should be reading these, man.
Yeah.
And so here I'd like to say, listener, how have these last 2 years been for you? If you've been with us the whole time, I'd certainly love to hear from you.
Yeah, what's funny is I wrote a question. You know how we always close each episode with questions that we're left with. One of the questions that I was left with was really about the show.
Yeah.
Number one, my question is, it requires a little bit of a foundation, I guess. Our intention has always been that we announce the previous episode, what we're reading next, so listeners can read along with us. Because we're not doing summaries of the text or anything like that when we're reading an episode. It really is like we read it and we're going to talk about it. Whatever comes to our mind is what we talk about. It's not intended to be like a supplementary text itself. You know what I mean? Like it's not Spark Notes.
Right. It's not an explainer.
Yeah. We're not trying to do that. But then my question, I guess, really is like, whom is the show for?
Yeah.
Then? I know the real answer is for us. I wouldn't have done all of this reading if we weren't sticking to this. You know what I mean? I would have been way slower with it, and I probably would have... I mean, we've given up on one text so far and switched gears one time.
Yeah.
But there are other texts that I wouldn't have finished had it not been for the show. You know what I mean?
We read all of Capital, and that's something I have attempted numerous times. So...
Yeah, so I know the show is really for us, but whom is the show for then? And I guess secondarily to that, would a reading calendar actually be helpful? We have privileged our ability to pivot and kind of just read whatever we want, wherever the wind takes us. But I think to you, the listener, the question is, have you read the text that we're discussing?
Yeah.
Or have you not? And why does that matter? Does that matter? Because, especially if I'm who I am today, and I listened to the episode 2 years ago, what am I getting from that?
Right.
As someone that has read State and Revolution already done all this other reading, already done, had my experience in organization or whatever, and then I'm listening to two schmoes talk about a book that they hardly understand.
Right.
What's the point of that? And so then I guess the answer really is like, for whom is the show made? It's really for people that are exactly like us, that were interested in revolutionary theory, but didn't have a lot of experience with it and were maybe a little intimidated by it and the community around it, right?
Yeah. Need some scaffolding to read the theory.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a question that I'm left with now that I can't answer. So I'm curious for the listener's response to that.
Yeah. If you do read along with us and you think a reading calendar would be helpful, you can let us know at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah. Everything we're reading, you can find pretty easily for free on the internet. But if you are like us and you're a Luddite and that needs an actual book in front of you, and likes to write in it and highlight and do all your sort of shit, a little bit more notice might be nice to get the book, So a calendar would be useful in that regard. I don't know. I don't want to get too mired in the details of the show, but that is a question that I have.
Fair enough.
I am curious, like you said, though, how many of you have stuck with us? How many of you are listening to episode 50 that were around when we recorded episode 2 or have jumped in whenever you did and then went backwards and started listening? How many? I'm curious if we have anyone.
Yeah. Here's maybe a better way to phrase it is, how's your revolutionary development been? You should let us know.
Hell yeah. That's way less selfish.
It's been so nice of you to join us for 50 episodes of A Radical Self-Education, and we'd love to hear from you how it's been.
Hell yeah.
leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Correct. Please.
Kind of, what that kind of gave is the PBS, supported by listeners like you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's jump into it.
State and revolution. Most of my thoughts this time around were really about the withering away of the state, if I'm being honest, because now that we just have a bigger picture of what withering away might actually entail, in the context of the theory and also in the context of the actual practice of these actually existing socialist countries, it's been a really interesting reflection since the last time we've read this, because we've had so many questions about, what it actually means for a state to wither away. And I don't know, that might not be a bad place to start.
I think we should start there.
Okay. Take it away, Aaron.
Well, first I would say my overall reaction this time around Lenin's approach to the state is a little more nuanced than it was the first time. The first time we read the text, anytime he talks about the destruction of the state, the abolishment of the state, smashing the state, I kept noting to myself, like, boy, he sounds kind of like an anarchist here. You know what I mean? But I realized this time around, because he kind of develops that thought through the chapters of the text, is that what he means is the bourgeois state.
Right.
And he recognizes that there will be a transitional proletarian state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, that has to take place before we see the full fruition of communism. And he's pretty nebulous about how long that process is going to take.
Yeah.
And so I recognized that nuance a lot sooner this go round. And so I was a lot less guarded and a lot less, critical of his rhetoric around the destruction of the state and its ultimate withering away. But I think the central point stands, which is that you won't see the abolition of the state, the complete withering away of the state, until you see a complete class abolition, period. Yeah. And so to expect any sort of evident reduction in the kind of quote-unquote bureaucracy of the state before that takes place, while you're in this transitional stage of the dictatorship of the proletariat, is foolhardy. And I was thinking a lot about China the whole time reading it this go-round.
Yeah, much the same.
I guess my first comment about that is China says 2050 is the goal. And I say, I'm happy to give them that amount of time.
Yeah.
Especially in a situation like Russia before the October Revolution, in a situation like China, where you have feudal states transitioning, an expectation that you're going to see any sort of withering away of the state within the lifetime of anyone that participated in that revolution is pretty fucking foolhardy. And I don't know, I'm just like considerably less reserved about accepting that and being like, let's see how it goes,
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that it's built into how Lenin talks about the timeline of the withering away, because he says that it's both gradual and spontaneous. We are at once smashing the old bourgeois state, but it's not that it's like entirely being destroyed. Yes, it is being smashed, destroyed, exploded, all of these lovely verbs, plus the German versions of them. But he even says, like, we're wresting the most vital functions of the state away from them. Like, we're still seizing parts of these institutions. It's just that the form in which they're happening is literally changing. It's no longer about the minority repressing the majority, but now the majority repressing the minority. And the thing that really came to me on this pass is the separateness of the state that Lenin talks about. You know, when we're talking about the creation of a state, in the bourgeois sense, he's literally talking about separate bodies, you know, and to extend that further, he's talking about the institutions of it, literal buildings, right? And the idea of the separateness of the state being an essential feature of its kind of body, I think is really important here, because when he's talking about the ability of the majority to repress the minority, he's saying that it doesn't require that same kind of special apparatus, you know? And so it's not just the idea of like one class organized against the other that necessarily makes it a state. It's also the fact that that measure of repression separates itself from society as well, you know? And it's interesting to think about that in the context of, say, actually existing socialism, right? Like, in what ways did the Soviet state start to separate itself from the masses of the people there? You know, I mean, I think that that might be a valid critique of the USSR and also maybe China. I don't know. I'm not as firm on that point. But what I'm trying to say is that that level of separateness is a reflection of the antagonism of the class. You know, the fact that the state as it is currently, this bourgeois state, is such this seemingly heavenly, specialized, idyllic representation is because it is representative of such a small minority against a large majority. You know, what Lenin is saying is that the same kind of apparatuses that may appear for repression, right, that may separate itself from society, will be so much smaller, so differently changed, because they are now a reflection of such a huge majority repressing a minority, that they don't require separate institutions at all. It's wrapped up in all of the further readings that we've done after we read this the first time. Each time a communist leader was talking about elevating the people, about institutionalizing the people, right? Coming back to State and Revolution is when it really does all click, because Lenin says it so clearly. He's talking about the habitualization of statecraft, you know, and in that habitualization, in that de-evolution, right, we are changing the form of what statecraft actually is. So much to the point where he talks about the fact that Engels said we shouldn't even say state at all. The word state here is misleading. Yeah. Like, we're almost using the language of the enemy at that point, right? Because we're not talking about a state. We're not talking about a separate apparatus. We're now talking about something that is integrated.
Yeah, let me try to wrap my thoughts around that. Lenin makes it quite clear that the state as an apparatus is a mechanism for repression, but the bourgeois state is a mechanism of the ruling class to repress the people. Once the people smash the bourgeois state, that does not mean that there is no need for repression to continue, but the repression will become the majority, the people, repressing the bourgeois reactionaries that are going to obviously fight back and try to get everything to go back to the way it was, because life was hunky-dory for them back then. So there's always going to be a need for some repressive institution as long as those people continue to exist, which is, like you were talking about, the habitualization. And you said something in one of the, episode 2 or 3 about that. It's kind of like goes back to what you were taught when you're 5 years old. And that's just the way that you live your life, because that's the way that you were taught life is supposed to be lived, right?
Yeah.
It's the same sort of thing. It's going to take a kind of generational shift where there is no longer the need for that repression, because it has become just an everyday occurrence that this is the way things are, and there's not going to be a reactionary response to that back to it.
Right. It's no longer separated.
Exactly. While at the same time, there's this other element that he kind of pulls in, and I don't mean to bastardize it or anything like that, but he talks about the people seizing the ready-made state, and there is a bureaucratic reason why that is also necessary, because there will be needs to be met for the people. And so those institutions, like literally the buildings, the streets, the infrastructure, is still necessary and can still be run and must still be run by, quote, some form of parliamentarism, right? But there's a significant difference in the, dictatorship of the proletariat, where the people are the ones in charge of this apparatus, because one, their positions are universally revocable all the time, and there's no opportunity for careerism, so there's no reason to game it and try to be shrewd in your facilitation of feeding the people or whatever. Who fucking gives a shit?
Yeah.
And then Two, again, those things will become so institutionalized, so much a part of the way that we run our lives on the day-to-day that it will no longer require special facilitation at a certain point. So again, the withering away of the state is kind of baked into that sort of facilitation. Even if we are smashing the bourgeois state, at the bottom, he's talking about, pulling from Engels here. First, I guess I'll say at the top, Engels emphasizes again and again that the state remains a state, i.e. it retains its fundamental and characteristic feature of transforming the officials, the servants of society, its organs into the masters of society, not only under a monarchy, but also in a democratic republic. But he goes on to counter that to the dictatorship of the proletariat and says that Engels approaches the interesting boundary line at which consistent democracy is transformed into socialism, at which it demands socialism. For in order to abolish the state, the functions of the civil service must be converted into the simple operations of control and accounting that can be performed by the vast majority of the population and ultimately by every single individual. And in order to abolish careerism, it must be made impossible for honorable, though not lucrative, posts in the public service to be used as a springboard to highly lucrative posts, blah, 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 blah. We transform the form of the state but maintain the function, right? You remove all the opportunities to bastardize the simple facilitation of offering goods and needs, services to people in need. And then every comptroller becomes, a mail carrier, you know what I mean? He uses the post office as an example.
Yeah.
You just run it like that. How many fucking shrewd mail carriers are there? What isn't to gain for them, or they want to be postmaster general or something?
Yeah, right.
Like once I don't know how to say it, you make it so mundane that one, anyone can do it, so there's no special privilege and it's not particularly difficult to move people in and out of positions as necessary. But two, you remove any need or desire to bastardize it in a way. So even though there will be elements of something that someone might look at the form and call it a state, to come back to finally what you were saying about how Engels says, don't use the language of the enemy, maybe we should call it a commune, whatever.
Yeah.
You could call it a state if you want to parse hairs, if you're one of the hair-splitting critics that Lenin says. But it no longer has the character of a state. So what are we fucking doing? Who cares?
Yeah. The argument that we've made endless times at this point is that same argument is flipped on its head. You call for the abolition of the state, whoever you are, but everything you're doing is just a state in its own right. Your organization of one class against the other is still a state. That's the exact same thing. And so I wanted to bring it to this quote on 338 because what you said about, what the proletariat is using the state for, I just think that this quote from Engels at the top of 338 really sets it. As long as the proletariat still uses the state, it does not use it in the interest of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries. And as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist. And then further down the page, he says, only in communist society, when the resistance of the capitalists has been completely broken, only then does the state cease to exist, and it becomes possible to speak of freedom. Only then will really complete democracy without any exceptions, be possible and be realized. And then democracy also begins to wither away.
Yeah.
Right? I'll come back to that in a second. But the adversaries really hold the key here, right? And what it made me think of was China again. What it made me think of was the Soviet Union, because when initially I was reading these passages about the state withering away, Lenin says things like, the state that must be created is one that has no choice but to wither away. And to me, that was really critical of actually existing socialism, right? Because what we've said in the past is that if the state is meant to wither away, why does it only seem to get larger? Why does it only seem to get more entrenched? And I've talked a little bit about how maybe the enlargement of the state isn't necessarily antithetical to its withering away on another episode. But I think that the adversaries really hold the key point here, right? What is the development of communism in China in its actual current situation, right? In its historical context, what has happened to China? It has been battered from the outside, right? What happened to the Soviet Union? Exactly the same thing. And so is it even fair to look at these states, these actually existing states, and say, why aren't you withering away? What the fuck? The job isn't done. Why are we talking about freedom in the context when the state doesn't exist to ensure freedom? It exists for the repression of the exploiters.
Yeah, you asked that question rhetorically, but the answer is no. It is not fair to expect withering away of a state when global communism has not been achieved. You know what I mean? There is always going to be the fear of encirclement, the fear of outside intervention until that happens. And I know that played at least some role in our reading Permanent Revolution right after this, which, we have less than generous feelings.
I was going to say, the thing is like the reason we read that is because it's kind of like the other, the fork in the road leading the other way. And what we saw there is that Trotsky is a fucking loser. Sorry. What's so interesting too about that, take the Chinese example, right? Say that capitalism globally dies tomorrow. It just croaks. What is the Chinese government to do? It's not like they seek to expand, right? That is a state that may be forced to wither away. You know what I mean? Not that I'm saying the Chinese situation is perfectly socialistic or whatever. I have complex feelings about that. But is the state put in place by the Chinese Revolution one that will wither away if the adversarial nature of the rest of the world were to disappear? Maybe. I don't know. It's certainly more likely than what we fucking have.
Agree with that. Yeah, hard agree on that.
So, like the Chinese have a situation where the party, which as far as we know is a proletarian party, a vanguard party, is in power. They do command the strictest control, as Lenin says. Are they in a situation where once the adversarial nature of the world is dealt with, they are in a position to wither away? Perhaps they are, is maybe what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I know, again, I'm not an expert on China, so feel free to come at me, but China still has to respond to global market forces. And I know a lot of the criticism that comes from communists about China is all going to be centered around that. My rebuttal to those criticisms is once the rest of that shit withers away, we'll see where they go. You know what I mean? We'll see what they do. Because they have to establish themselves, much like Lenin realized with the NEP, they have to establish themselves with a certain level of industrialization, a certain level of production in order to build the ready-made machinery of the state that can facilitate their movement out of that transitional stage and let those things wither away.
Also to get a little Leninist here, right? Like, he talks, not in this text, but in other ones, about shifting the antagonistic nature of the contradiction, right? Part of the development of the contradiction is maybe changing from one that is antagonistic to non-antagonistic, and consider that China has has less class antagonism in their society. Yeah. Not that I'm saying that they've resolved the conflict, clearly not the case, but just another way to look at that too.
Yeah, folks will bring up that union strike in 2018 or whatever. They talk about that shit all the time, whatever it's called. Yes. Is there no class antagonism in China? No, of course there is still class antagonism in China. Is there less class antagonism in China? Yes.
Yes. Yes, I would say so.
Yes.
So I don't know, just a lot of thoughts about withering away here.
Yeah.
Now, on top of that, there is another thing that withers away, and it's democracy. The first pass on this, that was really something that I could not deal with, right? The idea of democracy being something that's not necessary, right? Something that would also wither away. But coming back to it, I think that thinking about it as a separate institution is also pretty elucidating when it comes to democracy, because democracy in itself is a state. It's a means of organization to repress a minority by a majority in this sense. Right? It is closer to the expression of the repression of the minority by the majority that communists seek. And so that's why Lenin says it will be a huge part of its expansion. But it is in itself a separate structure for repression. And once the repression is no longer needed, it too will wither away. This time around, that made so much more sense to me, because it's not that the democratic principle is gone here. It's just that the actual separate apparatus, the actual separate institution of democracy, as in like we do a whole vote and then there is enforcement on the losers of the vote, so to speak, right? We're talking about a more free democracy where maybe those people aren't losers at all in that sense.
Yeah, I know a lot of our discomfort and a lot of our discussion the first time around was around that kind of dyspeptic feeling we were getting when he's talking about eradicating democracy. And at the time, I think we resolved at the end of our conversation with recognizing that distinction. He's talking about democracy as a state institution and not philosophically what democracy means, And so this time around, that felt a lot more clear to me. So I was considerably less concerned.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it just makes so much more sense. Like, even thinking about when he's talking about universal suffrage only being a measure of the maturity, even if everyone has the right to vote, their interaction with society is one that is still formed by capitalism. It reminds me, honestly, in the end of the book, I think he's talking about Bernstein when he says that we've tried representative democracy already in the English trade union struggle, and it's worthless. They've operated for 70 years under freedom. And Lenin says, what the fuck are you talking about, man? They've operated under capitalist slavery.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like universal suffrage is more democratic than many things. It shows the maturity because it's just saying that these people... Honestly, in a sense, it shows the capitalist maturity because it's saying you have the freedom to choose. We know you're going to choose capitalistically. You have already been habitualized into the structures of capitalism.
Yeah, it's almost like a psyop. It's it's controlled opposition. They know that if you have some semblance of participation, even though every fucking person that goes out to vote knows that their vote is effectively meaningless, the idea that they hold on to that institution as some sort of beacon of participation that gives them their voice or whatever, it's stupid.
Yeah. But the thing is, too, I mean, what Lenin is really saying is that, like, once that kind of institution has been so devolved, right, so spread out, so habitualized by everybody, we won't need a special apparatus to do democracy. It will simply become part of everybody's life. You know, you don't have to take it to a vote because, I was going to say, the ideas that you're voting for will already be evident, you know. But basically, I mean, what he's saying is that, like, the kind of rigmarole that we would otherwise need, like, a primitive democracy or some kind of democratic vote for is something that will be dealt with by everybody communally, you know, socialized.
Yeah, there's no need to take it, you know, to like a vote, so to speak, because you will already have figured that out in the facilitation of the thing. Yeah, I mean, he's got a couple of banger quotes that we called out the first time, but we'll say it again this time. On 336, this democracy is always restricted by the narrow framework of capitalist exploitation and consequently always remains in reality a democracy for the minority, only for the possessing classes, only for the rich. Freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics. Freedom for the slave owners.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's right. You can vote all you want, but if you're still voting in the context of a repressive system that isn't going to fucking listen to your vote anyway, that's not really democracy.
Right.
And I know, again, the way I'm talking about democracy is very much framed in a Western perspective around like what democracy has been sold to us in the United States to be. But don't make it less true, you know? I don't know.
Did you have a...
I have one more to throw out.
Yeah,
Just another quick quote to throw out on 304. To decide once every few years which member of the ruling class is to misrepresent the people in parliament is the real essence of bourgeois parliamentarism. Still a fucking banger line. Definitely a good encapsulation of what quote-unquote democracy means in the United States today.
Yeah, choose your repressor. Vote blue no matter who.
Yeah, exactly.
So, one thing that we kind of talked about the first time around was the idea of everyone being armed. And I had some kind of qualms about that because I was worried that being armed in itself was a separation. And I just kind of softened on that a little bit.
Yeah.
I was thinking too literally of what it meant to be armed. Every person owns a gun. What that just means is that everybody is ready to stop, you know, ready to repress, basically.
Yeah.
To be armed doesn't mean you all have weapons necessarily. It's just that you all have an armed intention. You know, that's really it. And even if it means you go run and get someone who is literally armed, that's still armed.
Yeah, I mean, I still am thinking of it quite literally, but I think there's an important distinction to be made if we're talking about in the post-revolution transitional stage and if we're talking about in the post-transitional stage, final phase of communism. I think there is a difference, and what our expectation should be about the people being armed and their readiness and willingness to join a militia, basically. You know what I mean?
You know what honestly was on my mind thinking about the armed organization of the population was police abolition. There will still be policing per se after the revolution. I'm not doing like a AO peep the badge, this is the proletarian police type beat. I'm like literally saying like the nature of what policing is will just fundamentally be changed, right? Even that is a little too like, there's a cop in your head and it will be realized, not, you know, but it's just like the idea of everyone being armed means that everybody is essentially policing, you know, but it's not that everyone is a police officer. We don't need a separate apparatus again to do it. It's just that the people are so comfortable with the idea of policing, so to speak, that it takes a completely different form. it goes back to what we said on the first time we read this, where it's a little bit like the social contract, like everybody both holds the expectation and is aware of the expectation of everybody that everyone else holds for them. And that creates a system which everyone acts accordingly. That's the kind of thing that we are seeking to realize in its fullest extent, essentially. What that might mean in grittier terms is like everyone's a cop, but it's not a cop in the same sense. I'm really fucking up my own metaphor here, but do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and I think that is going to come with our transition from being so immersed in individualism to a more communalized attitude. Right now, we are so indoctrinated in individualism that the idea of arming yourself, it's always about protecting yourself and protecting your shit, protecting whatever, It's very much about you, about the individual, where after enough time, enough generations have passed, enough people have lived full lives with their material needs being met, that they no longer have to fucking fight for scraps of food and a place to lay their weary head, and they are so immersed in a communal form of living where you rely upon others and you protect and care for others, that it no longer becomes like a weird, aberrant, or it's not an odd thought to think about protecting your community.
Right. It's not a separate institution at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know what? We already have there's already armed, organized masses, like a neighborhood watch.
Yeah.
You don't need a police officer. You just need like the community to understand what it means to be armed in this sense.
Yeah. Your use of the word like cop or police is like, I know that you don't mean it in that kind of flippant way, because that's exactly right. A neighborhood watch is in no way, depending on where you're at.
Right, yeah. It really depends.
Yeah, but a neighborhood watch can definitely be formed in a way that is community first, community based, and is not a bunch of fucking cops.
Right.
That's how the Black Panther Party started. Black Panther Party for self-defense.
That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. It goes back to it just not being a separate apparatus. It's just something that's integrated. This is a radical book, man. This is a revolutionary book.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, my comment on that earlier is just like, I feel like more a sign of where we are. Because again, I don't know.
No, it's just that now we are radical readers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, but back to the thing about arming the people, though, because I think there's a certain interpretation of what Lenin is saying here that I feel even still falling into an oversimplification, which is effectively like arm the people and you don't need an army, And I think that is wrong. I find fault in that as an attitude. If we're talking about the transitional stage where the dictatorship of the proletariat has taken place, because I do still think there needs to be a state apparatus for defense in that case. You know what I mean? Community militias aren't going to do the deal in that context. Yeah. I feel like his point, effectively his under no pretext to just arm the people and, the communities will take care of themselves. Maybe that's a misinterpretation, but that was my take on his position on arming the people. I think he's talking about the highest phase of communism there. I don't think he's talking about this transitional stage where community defense isn't enough. You need to talk about national defense in that case, because you still have borders in that case. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that you're totally right. And I think that it's born in the history of the Soviet Union. I mean, their defense against the Nazis is part of a communal defense in that sense, like the most people mobilized. If you want to talk about a massive organized armed resistance, the Red Army is a great fucking example of that, and to think of it as actually being so involved with Russian society. I mean, we've talked before about the toll of the Great Patriotic War. I think it's like 1 in 3 Russian adult men were killed. That's integration. I don't know how much of a separate body that really is. It is, in the formal sense, a separate body because it's a standing army, a professional army. But if we're talking about how separate that is from society, when we're talking about like its forms of repression, so to speak, I think that it might be closer to the ideal than we initially thought. Again, it's one of those things where it's like the enlargement isn't necessarily antithetical to withering away,
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think that this is related to Lenin's talk about the state at large and the shift from the state being a special force to a general force. I think the army, quote unquote, is the same sort of thing here.
Yeah.
In that transitional stage of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the army must still exist, but under the direction of the people, it is transitioned from a special force to a general force that is still online for national defense, still the front line,
right?
But it is now consistent of the people. It is not separated from the people.
It is a separate apparatus for repression, but now it is a repression of the minority by the majority being the people, the masses, the nation, not the nation, but in this case, the nation, right? In the context of socialism on a global stage, the nation.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. I was flipping through here because it was reminding me of my question about vigilantism the first time around. I'm thinking about how many good old boys have fucking caches of weapons worth tens of thousands of dollars, so many rounds, all this sort of shit. And the moment that they feel like...
It's fucking Killdozer, man. The guy wants to dump open sewage and the government says no, and then he goes crazy and fucking becomes unreasonable.
Yeah, it's just... I don't even know what my point or my question is, I guess. It's just...
How do you control that kind of energy?
Yeah, my concern is those folks in this position. Like, I know that the answer is still the People's Army. The People's Army needs to stand against those folks in repression, because that is still a case of the majority repressing the minority. But there are a lot of those good old boys in the United States. You know what I mean? Sure. And I don't know, I still have some level of discomfort with that. Or
you just need to think more dialectically about it, man. We're changing the conditions that, the reason that those people are so fucking crazed is because they're habituated to feel that way. You know what I mean?
Yes.
If we change the conditions, if the people understand the threats that are actually at large, then they also will change, What are they really afraid of? What are those people stocking up for? It's just the context of like what they're actually living through that's making them act that way. If they go through the glorious People's Revolution and they say, damn, man, my cachet is now part of the armed organization of self-defense for the glorious people, the people I, in my mind, have always been rooting for, then, who's to say they do need to be repressed? I don't even necessarily think they'll be that crazy. You just got to point them in the right direction. That's how I feel about a lot of the lumpen proletariat, might I add. You just got to point them in the right direction. I'm just being honest.
Okay, I'll accept that.
It's just the case, man. These people are already gung-ho about national defense. They just need to know who they're defending against.
Here's the question at the heart of my concern. The question is rehabilitation possible for sexual assailants? My answer to justice in that case is a smoking gun.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
But I know that there are plenty of communists that would come at me and say that there is rehabilitation possible for those individuals. And I know that there is a context where a community would willfully make the decision to exorcise that person.
Yes.
And so it is then a decision of the majority, at least in that case, acting in their own interest. But there's still a question of unease there. There's still a situation there that I think if you expand that out and you can see how that would create contradiction that could be problematic in the long run. What do you know? I bungled explaining a point in the moment. Editor Aaron here, and there's sort of a jump in my thinking that I didn't explain very well here that I feel obligated to rectify now. Firstly, my underlying concern about vigilantism is the appropriate response to reactionaries. The so-called good old boys mentioned here are a legitimate threat and a counter-revolutionary concern that needs to be addressed in the context of the U.S. That was my first point. What is the appropriate reaction to this issue, which I think Will correctly sussed out and answered, which is over time, the habitual shift that addresses the material needs of the people will also shift attitudes towards self-defense, and this problem will over time kind of sort itself out. Secondly, though, I have a concern from the other side, which is this. How do we as a community appropriately distinguish between rightful repression of dissidents, such as sexual assailants, and that other form, that counter-revolutionary reaction, protecting appropriate response from, say, a community militia from repression against vigilantism? I'll add that the point I make there about the belief that no one is above restitution is at the center of this second question for me. My mind is made up about the appropriate reaction to heinous actions, things like sexual assault, and I know that may put me in the category of vigilante to some communists. I don't want to split hairs and parse something that can be answered by take a vote into an endless deconstruction of questions, but I think there's a tension there that is still a bit unsettled for me. Any further recommendations to help my thinking are always welcome, but otherwise, back to the show.
I think that there's a tangential conversation because a lot of what I actually thought about in the context of China in this book had to do with the Cultural Revolution. The idea of the masses willingly self-organizing and doing voluntary centralism, essentially.
Yeah.
Only in the small context we've talked about the Cultural Revolution, where it's like Mao's organizing the people against the ossified party or whatever. I start to see the semblance of the kind of state withering away that Lenin's talking about. Part of the rockiness of the Cultural Revolution is that same kind of vigilante risk that you're talking about, is that the ways in which the energies of the people are focused, how do you line that up with communist goals? You know what I mean? And so I don't know what it's going to take to change that. I just think that it's going to be something that happens in the development of it. I don't know.
Cultural Revolution is a really good thing to bring up, though, in this context of vigilantism.
Yeah.
Vigilantism.
Not to be like Bernstein and say wait and see, but it's just the kind of thing that has to play out. If we really do want the people to integrate themselves into the state, for the state to become so superfluous amongst the people that it is not required as a separate apparatus anymore, then that will require a serious change in people. And, it even goes back to Engels talking about it being a generational thing. Like, imagine if that consciousness was unlocked tomorrow. It would be anarchy. It would be craziness. It would be vigilantism, because it hasn't been habitualized in the way that Engels, Lenin, they're talking about. And so I think that it's just something that will have to happen in development. And, part of that proletarian state apparatus that exists is to kind of soothe that. That is where it needs to be repressed, is that kind of chaotic outburst, because that in itself is a threat to the revolution.
Word.
I don't know. It just kind of all comes together there for me, because I'm so glad we reread this, man. Because, I just feel a lot firmer on the withering away of it now, whereas before we were kind of really questioning it and being like, what does this actually mean? I think we were looking at so literally the idea of it withering away, like the state immediately starts to crumble and turn to dust. And it's like, why isn't this happening? It's just not really in the same context, because what we're talking about is something that is gradual, even if it is hugely spontaneous. It is something that is still generational.
Yep. And, I don't know, something that was just striking me while you were talking through that was thinking about how much social attitudes change generationally. I'm thinking about isms, sexism, racism, homophobia, whatever. The social attitude toward these things definitely has shown progress over the decades, but the state institutions are still at play in the same way that they're perpetuating the same outcomes, despite that kind of shift in social attitude generally, right? Yeah. And so, the idea that removal of that state apparatus forcing a particular form of repression upon, X group in whatever case, seeing the habitual shift as generations get used to the shift in the social consciousness, you know what I mean? How easily that comes to us naturally in those cases, you know what I mean? To think of somewhat of my father's generation and the attitudes toward homosexuality, and then think of our generation and attitudes towards homosexuality, regardless of the actual concrete material rights afforded to queer folks, because that's coming from the state, that's an institutionalized situation. But to see that kind of generational shift, imagine if there were no form of repression coming from the state, to see these attitudes shift in real time, how easy it is to imagine how we just become habituated to a different attitude, a different outlook, if we just let time pass. I
was thinking about it the other day because I was thinking about Target Pride sections again. I heard an ad for what it was. I was on Spotify and the DJ went, "Yo, what up, Will? Here's a collection of LGBTQ plus focused artists for you." And I was like, I didn't ask for this, but sure. And I was thinking about how people get pissed off and they're like, you can be gay, just don't make it your whole personality, don't shove it down my throat, da da da. I don't want to.
You mean?
What?
Idiots?
Yes, idiots. I'm not excusing those people. Those guys are dumbasses. What I'm saying, though, is that, I was thinking a lot about that because, that anger stems from the fact that you're seeing these things in places that otherwise were previously completely heterodox. And that introduction of that is a reflection of the historical position of these subgroups, especially gay people, it's like kind of corporate affirmative action at this point, you know, like we're trying to reclaim this kind of lost profit from this particular group. And the thing is that like part of the reason you're so angry at that is because you're still operating in a capitalist context. You're like, all of these traits should be catered to me. And it's like outside of the context of this being the pride section at Target, what am I trying to say here, man? I don't know. It just seems fucking ridiculous sometimes. And it's like, it's exactly what you were saying. It's like, just take it out of the context of capitalism and you could see these things change in such a much an easier way. You know, it just takes time.
Yeah.
It also just takes exposure too. Like, yeah.
That's the other part of it is, you know, I don't want to be one of those folks. I've lamented this in the past, I know, because I don't think you have to have firsthand experience to feel empathy. I get real fucking annoyed at people that are like, I've got a daughter, I've got a wife. Bitch, who fucking cares? You should care about people regardless. You know what I mean? I think that is generally a dumb position to take, but it seems to be proven that the more you are around people that are different than you, the more you recognize that you're not actually that different from those people. You know what I mean? And so like you become considerably more comfortable and less bigoted, essentially. You know what I mean? And in the context that we're talking about in this transition where we are moving out of this rugged individualism into a more communal way of life, those sorts of interactions are bound to just become commonplace anyway. So we might even see that move with more rapidity. You know, those sorts of changes in the social zeitgeist would change because our community is vastly different and more diverse.
Yes. I was going to say there's a great quote on 344. Not necessarily to do with, gay liberation now, but I think this is applicable because what Lenin says is, and seeing how capitalism is already retarding this development to an incredible degree, seeing how much progress could be achieved even on the basis of the present level of modern technique, we have a right to say with the fullest confidence that the expropriation of the capitalists will inevitably result in the enormous development of the productive forces of human society. And I'm here to say it's not just actual production that he's talking about, but also social production.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I've got something to say about the dictatorship of the proletariat. So the first time around, I think we were on board with what Lenin was saying. I think there was some, liberal hesitation with the concept of a dictatorship or whatever. And even the use of the word totalitarian was thrown around, not in that we were characterizing it as totalitarian, but that's a common rebuttal that you hear, especially when you're talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat. But there are a couple of things that I wanted to throw out around the dictatorship of the proletariat. First, Lenin is quick to point out that it was Marx and Engels themselves in the manifesto, this is on 286, that are first calling for something like the dictatorship of the proletariat. In this quote from Marx and Engels, he shares with us, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. So even though they're not naming it, Lenin tells us here that this is the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, spelled out concretely by Marx and Engels. This is the proletariat organized as the ruling class. And he develops that a little bit further if we go to 294. Again, he's talking about the class struggle necessarily leading to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And folks that argue against that, he says, are wrong. To limit Marxism to the theory of the class struggle means curtailing Marxism, distorting it, reducing it to something which is acceptable to the bourgeoisie. A Marxist is one who extends the acceptance of the class struggle to the acceptance of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I read that quote because I want to say this. I agree with Lenin. If you don't fuck with the dictatorship of the proletariat, then you and I are not the same kind of Marxists. And I, frankly, will now, with some assurance, question your foundation and intention. There is, I know that there is a group of Marxists that will say that revisionism started with Lenin, and I think that that's fucking bonkers. To call Lenin a revisionist in any derogatory way is just so silly to me, and I just want it to go on record. I fuck with the dictatorship of the proletariat.
I just don't understand what the alternative is, especially if you're thinking about it as the proletarian organizes the ruling class. Like, what else? You tell me what your communistic solution is that isn't the proletariat organizes the ruling class. I simply don't understand.
Yeah. He lays it out quite clearly. It has to go through these stages. You go from capitalism to the dictatorship of the proletariat to communism. There needs to be that transitional state. On 336, he says, earlier the question was put in this way. In order to achieve its emancipation, the proletariat must overthrow the bourgeoisie, conquer political power, and establish its own revolutionary dictatorship. And he says, to put it another way, the transition from capitalist society, which is developing towards communism, to a communist society is impossible without a political transition period. And the state in this period can only be the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Full stop.
Again, what else could it be?
Exactly. There's what?
What are you putting in that play? What is it? Because he says, we are not utopians. We do not indulge in dreams of dispensing at once with all administration, with all subordination. These anarchist dreams, based upon a lack of understanding of the tasks of the proletarian dictatorship, are totally alien to Marxism, and as a matter of fact, serve only to postpone the socialist revolution until human nature is changed. No, we want the socialist revolution with human nature as it is now, with human nature that cannot dispense with subordination, control, and managers. Any kind of organization that you're putting in place after a revolution, surprise, surprise, probably the dictatorship of the proletariat, whether you call it that or not.
Yeah.
If you're doing real revolution and you're putting something in place afterwards to then, cement your control, even if that's the control of all the people, surprise, that's the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah.
I don't know how you could argue otherwise.
You can call it whatever the fuck you want. It's going to look like the mass of people working together democratically to protect their interests and the interests of everyone else.
Yeah. Oh, what's that? One class organized for the repression of the other class? Interesting. That's a state, isn't it? Yeah. It's the dictatorship of the proletariat.
The mass of proletarians seek to dictate the way that their organization is run. What should we call it?
Yeah. And can I just say, I love on 307, he's talking about the gradual creation of an order without quotation marks, which will be different from wage slavery, an order in which the functions of control become more and more simple, will be performed by each in turn, then become a habit and finally die out as the special functions of a special stratum of the population. So the dictatorship of the proletariat doesn't really have a choice but to wither away. I'm here for it.
Yeah.
Now somebody just do it, man. Somebody give it a crack.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Would you like to hit the cavalcade?
Yeah, we didn't have the cavalcade of quotes back in the early days of the show, so let's do a cavalcade.
I do have one on 279. He's talking about all of the cronies and corrupted officials, and he says, are they direct or only the indirect allies of the millionaire treasury looters? And the answer is, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, that's good. I've got one on 287.
Okay.
This is really just a great phrase. We were talking the first time we read it about how funny Lenin is, and I think his fervor definitely leaps off the page. You can tell that he's writing this on the eve of revolution because he was writing it on the eve of revolution. But he also just knows how to spin a good fucking sentence. The petty bourgeois Democrats, those alleged socialists who substitute dreams of class harmony for the class struggle, even picture the socialist reformation in a dreamy fashion. Not in the form of the overthrow of the rule of the exploiting class, but in the form of the peaceful submission of the minority to the majority, which has become conscious of its aims. I love that phrase, substituting the dreams of class harmony instead. And then when he's talking about peaceful submission, it brought things to mind like Allende to mind for me, and this idea that there is some way to have a non-violent revolution.
Yeah. Just to extend on that too, he says next, the petty bourgeois utopia, which is inseparably bound up with the idea of the state being above the classes. That part is so critical to me because it's the idea of like the state is just this floating being. You're not recognizing that the state that you're talking about seizing, controlling, directing is one that was created because of these class antagonisms. It was created to serve this purpose. What needs to happen, what Lenin is saying here, is that those things must be smashed. Yes, there are elements of control of that state that you want, but they they must be wrested from the control of the bourgeois state, and they must be transformed into measures of proletarian control.
Yeah. That's just bringing to mind, it's not about having better representation in the boardroom. It's about destroying the fucking boardroom.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was going to say, just to follow up on that,
yeah,
not about better representations, right? Same thing on 289, because he's talking about how all the revolutions of the past perfected this machine instead of smashing it up.
Yeah.
It's like, we're not looking to perfect this machine. We are looking to abolish it.
Exactly. Just to switch gears to move on to another one on 302. This is at the end of that top paragraph. Just as the Christians after Christianity had attained the position of a state religion, forgot the naivete of primitive Christianity with its democratic revolutionary spirit. That just really spoke to me. I think I've many times lamented the state of Christianity in the United States. I am an atheist, so I'm speaking of it from the outside, but a big part of that comes from being raised Baptist and coming up around it and seeing the hypocrisy of the church and seeing how few Christians actually behave like Christians are told they're supposed to behave. And just to see him name that they, quote, forget this idea that came with their primitive Christianity and how democratic and revolutionary the spirit of that quote unquote primitive Christianity was. You know, I don't fuck with Jesus, but if you do, you should recognize this is a dude that's fucking turning over tables and feeding the people.
Yeah.
He's a woolen-haired socialist, my friends.
Yeah, and it's also a reflection too of what Lenin says there will be a return to primitive democracy in the same sense, like democracy as we know it today has forgotten its revolutionary roots.
Yeah.
What real democracy looks like, what the real ideals of Christianity might actually look like, are closer to what we actually want rather than what's actually practiced today.
Yeah.
You know?
Way to go, Lenin.
Woohoo! I love on 305, revolutionary democratic phrases to gull the simple Simons, bureaucracy and red tape for the benefit of the capitalists. This is the essence of the honest coalition.
Yeah.
Like, maybe the biggest threat is still opportunism. Isn't that that feels like an insane thing to say? But that's a real thought I had here, is that, like, part of my dismay in the kind of state of the parties that we have in the U.S. today is because they're opportunist, and I think I just haven't been comfortable saying that because I've been willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, and it's like, I don't actually think that's the case.
Well, yeah, that's because we're in the position of
desperation,
picking from the shit.
Yeah. Yeah. So just wanted to say.
And I don't know. I mean, I don't want to speak out of turn here, and I'm going to show my ignorance as usual, but we have the benefit of looking at the USSR in hindsight that Lenin did not. And to see opportunism take hold in the USSR, we know how it plays out.
Yeah.
We know how it did play out. He didn't, but he fucking called it.
Right. It happened in the last book, but I really started to feel anti-Khrushchev and anti-Brezhnev even, like caretakers of the empire gone wrong at that point. Like, they were watching it fall apart partially because of their own actions, their own misunderstanding of what the revolution actually entailed. I kind of feel that way now. Before, I was kind of willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe not so much anymore.
No, I think I have extended, if we're talking about when we read this the first time, I have extended the level of adherence I have through Stalin. But it ends with Khrushchev for me.
Yeah, I think we're aligned here.
We had a couple of anti-Stalin little comments that slipped out in the first couple of episodes too. So
it's mostly because it's funny,
maybe.
Initially, it was ironic. I've done the thing where it's like ironic interest, and then it just becomes genuine. I made so many jokes about Stalin that I finally read enough Stalin to be like, okay. Yeah, I guess. I didn't realize this the first time, but now that we've actually kind of read it, he essentially quotes almost all of Engels's On Authority.
Yeah.
Like, essentially, he puts the whole thing in this book.
He really does. And there's one of the chapters opens with him saying, like, some people would lament how much I'm quoting Engels here, but, stick with me. It's necessary.
Yeah, it's like, you gotta.
Yeah.
Yeah. But honestly, respect, man.
Yeah.
I'm just impressed by this because, like, it's so funny that we started with this and then we went and read all the things that were in this, because Lenin has done the work for us already in this book. He said, like, I've done the required reading. Here's all the messages. Here's how people are responding to it now and why they're wrong. Here's how you should actually respond to it. Yeah. And then we were like, better double check these sources. We went and read all the source material. And now it's like, damn, Lenin, you were snapping.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think of Marxism as a science under development, it makes sense that you read the most recent development because it should encapsulate everything that came before it. But I think there's also merit in doing what we did, which is starting somewhere. I think you should start wherever you want to start.
Yeah.
Wherever you think you should start is the best place to start. But to go back and read all of the other texts that are almost certainly going to be referenced in whatever it is you're reading only helps to concretize your thinking around each of those texts. And I felt that way big time with reading Capital.
Yeah.
And Capital on its own, I think I got everything that I really need, quote unquote, from Wage, Labor, and Profit, which is fucking 70 pages long or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As opposed to the 600 pages of Capital Volume 1 that we read. But having gone through it and then doing it the way we did it, where we were reading other stuff at the same time, it was so fun to see everyone referencing something from Capital that we had just read as we're reading the other stuff. It just really helps pull it all together, or at least it did for me.
Yeah.
We even talked about that on the episode before, where it was like, do we really need to go back and read Marx? Lenin is doing all of the Marxing for us here.
Yeah, totally. Well, I was going to say, I'm just looking at 334 because there's something that Lenin says here, which I think is applicable to this. And he says, there's no trace of an attempt on Marx's part to conjure up a utopia, to make idle guesses about what cannot be known. Marx treats the question of communism in the same way a naturalist would treat the question of the development of, say, a new biological species, if he knew that such and such was its origin, such and such the direction in which it was changing. Mm-hmm. It's like we're not here to make idle speculation of what communism actually is. We want to see its development. I want to see its origin. I want to see the things it's gone through. I want to see its successes and I want to see its failures, because all of those things are part of the development of the communism that we seek today.
Absolutely.
Just on the opposing page, 335, I really appreciated when he just says that the present day state is therefore a fiction. We've been talking about the state monolithically. The reality of it is that the state, as it is of numerous forms of organization, I mean, yes, the state is like any organization of one class against the other in that sense, but the way that is organized is vastly different in so many places. There's a part where he's talking about Marx initially having an exception on the idea of peaceful transition to socialism. He said it would be maybe possible in some places like the UK. And what Lenin says is that we live in the age of imperialism now. That exception is long gone.
Yeah.
So like even if there are different forms of the state and there's no single present day state, it still needs to be overthrown. It's kind of two points that I've woven together there into one.
Okay, I guess I have two with regard to the withering away of the state. They're kind of related, and forgive me for reading some longer blocks here, but on 346, he's talking about this transitional state. He says, in its first phase or first stage, communism cannot as yet be economically ripe and entirely free from all the traditions and all the traces of capitalism. Hence, the interesting phenomenon that communism in its first phase retains the narrow horizon of bourgeois right, which is a quote from Marx. Of course, bourgeois right in regard to distribution of articles of consumption inevitably presupposes the existence of the bourgeois state, for right is nothing without an apparatus capable of enforcing the observance of the standards of right. And I recall us having a conversation around rights, and the question was kind of like, what is a right if it's not enforceable? And getting wrapped up in that kind of conversation. And something new to me this time, a really interesting nuance on why the transitional state is needed is because, like we're talking about in that habituation, that kind of shift, that's not going to happen overnight. It takes time to shed our bourgeois expectations, and that shift is inevitable when we're being birthed from capitalism. It is inevitable that some of the kind of remnants of that capitalist or bourgeois expectation or bourgeois way of life is still bleeding into this transitional stage. So, of course, that transitional state is going to be necessary because we need that time to move out of those kind of situations where those bourgeois expectations of, say, a right is still kind of bleeding into our daily life. You know what I mean? And to that, on the next page, on 348, I guess, he continues, accounting and control, these are the principal things that are necessary for the setting up and correct functioning of the first phase of communist society. All citizens are transformed into the salaried employees of the state, which consist of the armed workers. All citizens become employees and workers of a single national state syndicate. All that is required is that they should work equally, do their proper share of work, and get paid equally. The accounting and control necessary for this have been so utterly simplified by capitalism that they have become the extraordinarily simple operations of checking, recording, and issuing receipts, which anyone who can read and write and who knows the first 4 rules of arithmetic can perform. So, number one, I think that there's something really interesting there about that kind of shift from the specific to the general, right? Everyone becomes capable of performing any task any of these bureaucratic administrative tasks in the state, and therefore it no longer really takes the characteristic of a state because it's not a specialized thing. You don't, like I said, every comptroller becomes a mail carrier. You can do any of those things, so there's no special privilege afforded to that position. So is it really a state in that sense? You know what I mean?
I just had the same thought about rights, like I can't think of a specific right now. I don't know, the right to housing. If everybody was housed all the time and it was guaranteed societally to the point where it was never even a consideration, would it ever be considered a right at all?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And another point is that in this transitional stage, the first stage, the dictatorship of the proletariat, there is also still that infrastructure of the previous bourgeois state to some degree will continue, right? So coming from capitalism, that infrastructure is already there. So even the facilitation of this level of administration becomes simple to us, which was once a quote unquote like specialized, maybe elected position. It becomes simple because the mechanism is already there. It's already constructed. We just need to operate it. Another reason why that transitional stage is necessary, but also why it would also over time facilitate its own withering away. Anyway.
No, dude, I just think like it's so funny to feel this way because the first time I felt so conflicted about what withering away actually meant. And now I'm like, it just seems so obvious.
Yeah, it feels self-evident now.
Yeah. We've just become more dialectical thinkers, Aaron. I hope you realize.
We're just Lenin stans, I guess.
We are Lenin stans, man. Damn. There's a great bit in Collapse about Gorbachev, because fun fact about Gorbachev, he considered himself for a period to be a neo-Leninist. One of the things he wanted to do was expand the kind of like on-the-ground level of democracy, because he thought that would be a better reflection of what the true Leninist model actually was. Spoiler, it didn't fucking work. But there's a point where he reads like some Soviet dissident's article about how Lenin's a destroyer, and he like loses his whole faith. He like starts to cry, and he's like talking to like some other Politburo member, and he's like, Lenin is a destroyer. And I'm just like, what the fuck is going on here, dude? So for a second I was like, maybe we should read something critical of Lenin, but I don't actually want to have a terrible emotional breakdown like that, so maybe not.
If you've got a critical of Lenin recommendation, send it to us at leftonrightfeedback@gmail.com.
Heavy asterisk, not by anarchists. Sorry.
It'll be a council communist or something. Maybe.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's okay. I mean, Rosa Luxemburg even has some Lenin critical stuff. So.
That's a good point.
Yeah, left
and
of
we
Lenin.
we fuck with Rosa.
Yeah, word. What questions did you have this time around, Aaron?
Oh yeah. In a very similar vein, I'm looking for a recommendation. Knowing when Lenin wrote this on the eve of the October Revolution, and knowing what came of the USSR under Lenin's stead, my question is what Lenin to read to see his development, specifically around the NEP.
Yeah.
I would like to know what he had to say directly about why it was necessary, and even if there's any sort of reflection on it after the fact. I know that he wasn't around too long after that, but
Sure.
Is there a Lenin that we should be reading that would maybe shed some light on that? I would love to read that for the show.
The answer to that is not necessarily Lenin, but it's actually Bukharin, who we haven't read any of because he was a big NEP guy. And I mean, he was part of the implementation. I'd be genuinely interested in exploring that kind of thing as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you have some good recs, let us know, listener.
I already stated my other ones poorly early at the beginning, which was about the show. So what questions did you have?
I think my biggest question has to do with, I think it's one of the questions that Lenin asks, and it's like, what kind of development will the state undergo under communism? And I think that that's a question that's much more prescient than it seems at first glance, because I'm expanding that to include things like China now. In what way does the Chinese state develop, or the Vietnamese state develop, or the Cuban state develop? And, they've been operating under socialism. How has that changed the state? And here's another question. It's kind of a depressing question, honestly, but like, to what extent does the total withering of the state rely on global revolution? It seems that the answer is 100%.
Heavily, at least, yeah.
But just another question to explore there, what is that actually going to take? Because I'm thinking again of Stalin when he says that there is peaceful transition possible. It just requires encirclement.
Yeah.
You know?
He's not wrong.
He's not wrong. Common Stalin W. Okay.
You should read this if...
You should read this, okay? You should read this if you haven't. You should read this if you have questions about the state, if you have questions about revolution. If you're an anarchist and you don't have a fucking clue what Lenin's about, you've been told to hate him, you can read this, believe it or not.
Yeah, much the same. You should read this if you haven't. You should read this if...
Shit, you should read this if you have.
True. Good point. We did. I was going to say you should read this if... The way that I wrote it to myself, you should read this if you believe in universal suffrage. But you should read this if you believe in universal suffrage and you have been led to believe that communism does not offer that. You should read this if you have liberal hesitation to communism around the concept of democracy.
Right. Don't let anyone else tell you what Lenin's saying because he wrote it down. You can read it yourself.
Exactly. You should read this, period.
You should read this, okay?
You should read this even if you are intimidated to read it.
Yes. There's nothing to be intimidated about, okay? I felt this way the first time because so much of this is polemical, all right? On the second pass, the polemics fade right away because Lenin isn't talking about Kautsky or Bernstein or Pannekoek or any of these people. What he's talking about is the way that people are thinking about the state, the way that people are organizing themselves for or against revolution. And we are still engaged in those same conversations. It's not about Bernstein or Kautsky or any of those guys. It's about what it is actually going to take to transition society from capitalism into communism. Don't let the polemics get you down. It's interesting in a larger historical context, but they're also not important. The message is what's more important. That's how I feel about that. Because all of the early Lenin that we read, I was like, so much of this is like, it's
Dude hates Kautsky.
Yeah, so funny, so funny. It's not about Karl Kautsky at all.
Yeah, very little.
You know, would we even remember Karl Kautsky if it weren't for Lenin? We wouldn't. That's for sure.
Yeah, certainly not.
Yeah.
That's good.
leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. Email us.
Yeah, we've loved hearing from people through the show. So any comment at all, whatever it is, even if you just want to say, hey, what's up, leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah. What are we reading next, Aaron?
Next, we're going to read We Are Heirs of the World's Revolutions by Thomas Sankara.
Yeah. A little bit more exploration of Thomas Sankara, everyone's goat. Apparently, allegedly. We'll see. We'll find out.
Yeah, I think talking about Africa has been a little bit of a blind spot on the show up until this point. So really looking forward to getting a little bit more of that. And just, getting some Sankara in the show. And
yeah, still topical, too, when it comes to Burkina Faso in the current context. Mm-hmm. You know, Ibrahim Traore is spoken of quite dotingly in the anti-imperialist context. I don't have much more information aside from that, so that's where I'll leave that one.
Yeah.
But I think this will be a really interesting, a nice starting place. I'll say that.
Yeah. So stoked to read it. Get your copy.
And don't get left unread.
That's right. Bye-bye.
See ya.